What is the Progressive Era? The Progressive Era ranged from the 1890s through the 1920s. This era focused on eliminating problems with industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and political corruption. Benefits that surfaced because of these efforts in the era consisted of more consumer goods, providing low-skilled jobs for the lower class, and more opportunities for the middle class. However, limitations occurred which consisted of the mistreatment of workers, imbalanced wealth distribution, and government corruption. In turn, Progressive-era reformers in the federal government focused on resolving these issues by working to decrease the power of monopolies, providing support to the lower-class residents, and standing up for the unprecedented peoples in the United States. Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive president who sought to gain power from trusts. As seen in the cartoon, Roosevelt is displayed as a hunter who kills bad trusts, has a hold on the good trusts, and has no control over the non-corrupt corporations. The point of this cartoon was to invoke fear in the good trusts and cause them to reform. The Clayton Antitrust Act of October 15, 1914 sought for trusts to not be discriminatory in pricing. This is supported by the quote, "It shall be unlawful for any person engaged in commerce, in the course of such commerce, either directly or indirectly, to discriminate in price between different purchasers of commodities." Even though their efforts, President Theodore Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson were not successful in their efforts. On the other hand, however, Louis Brandeis teamed up with Wilson and took on cases against trusts. This includes the New England Railroad Company. This ended up being successful. Theodore Roosevelt's efforts of destroying bad trusts and the Clayton Antitrust Act were both unsuccessful in their efforts, and didn't substantially decrease the power of monopolies. The Neil Reynolds Report of June 4, 1906, was written to expose the health dangers of workers. This document was used to explain the unsanitary conditions in which workers had to work in. This was in order to invoke a change in sanitation for the lower-class workers. In 1909, Jane Addams wrote The Spirit of Youth in the City Streets. This was written about how children were working in factories at such a young age instead of getting the proper schooling and normal mental and muscular requirements that they need for development. The purpose of this was to get children out of factories, and it also shows how modern industry has affected people's opinion on whether or not children should be working in factories or not. The court case of Hammer v. Dagenhart of 1918 was brought to trial to stop the enforcement of the Act of Congress to prevent the further production of child labor in cotton mills. In order to ease the financial status of the poorer citizens of the United States, Governor Robert Follett issued the income tax. This tax varied on the amount of income an individual receives. Naturally, this value varies between different individuals. Both the Neil Reynolds Report of 1906 and The Spirit of Youth in the City Streets, written by Jane Addams, were successful in their efforts of supporting the lower class. In 1919, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote his book titled The Crisis. In his book, he talked about how African Americans were treated unfairly compared to the other U.S. citizens. This was written in order to gain more equality for African Americans. In 1918, Kaiser Wilson made a sign which spoke out against how women were not self-governed. In this sign, she compared women to how Americans treated Germans at this time. The purpose of this sign was for Americans to see how wrongly women were being treated. Even though the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution granted African Americans equal rights and the right to vote, they were still being oppressed and segregated. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke out against the inequality of African Americans. His efforts encouraged other African Americans to seek for change in their basic rights. This also allowed for them to feel empowered. Kaiser Wilson was also successful in her efforts, and her efforts encouraged the 19th Amendment to be added to the U.S. Constitution. The efforts of the Progressive Era reformers in the federal government can be compared to those of the antebellum time period. For example, Dorothea Dix was an advocate for the unprecedented mentally ill people in the United States. In her efforts, she created insane asylums to house the mentally ill. Relating to the decreasing power of monopolies, Northerners of this time period supported the slaves and wanted to overthrow the oppression of the slaveholders in the Southern states. Lastly, support of the lower class can be related to how women of this time period had hazardous work environments and made little profits, while the factory owners made larger profits from these women.